accepting our invitation as well. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nada. Ngā mihi nunui to you. Nada, also kia koutou solar to the tauira there as students and all others. I'm the chair of the Landscape Foundation, and I took on the task of seeking writers for a book which would explain the breadth and relevance of landscape. We decided it should be Māori-led because Māori connections are less well understood by others to landscape, and we felt that was important for professional decision making and for the professions. We also have made this place-based. It's unashamedly about the New Zealand landscape, land, and the breadth that that implies. But I also went out to internationals, to other people who worked in landscape, poets, Aboriginal in Australia, two writers from Ireland, a Native American who paints, because we felt that they could also give us a better understanding of our values by reflecting back, and also they had something to add. I went out to over 80 people. They are all luminaries, and the ones that responded were absolutely brilliant. So I think you've got the best of the best when you read this book. Today we've got 5 of our now 7 trustees, as well as our editor, Carolyn Hill, who worked as a volunteer for us. And we were just so grateful for the time that she put into the book and turned it into a book rather than a collection of writing. So I'm going to hand over to Sam to explain why it was that we were doing a book in the first place. Sam. So I'm not going to hand it over to Sam.
Oh, kia ora, Di.
Yes,
hey, thanks, Nada and Di. It's a regular occurrence, isn't it, on these team meetings that you forget to put on the mic. Sorry about that. Kia ora, everyone. Sam Bourne. I'm a trustee of the Landscape Foundation. I'm an NZILA registered landscape architect, and I'm the team lead for urban design at Place at Whakakotahi, the New Zealand Transport Agency. We're just going to go through, I guess, the story of the book. So I'm going to introduce you to the role of the foundation. Nada, if you could just jump to the next slide. So we're a small group of advocates around landscape, people, wellbeing in place. I guess our drive is around setting up advocacy for landscape, being a voice for landscape in Aotearoa New Zealand. And obviously we have quite a unique context here, both our environmental context and as a fragment of Gondwana, and also our cultural context linked to Māori and Polynesian exploration of the Pacific and colonization by the British as well. So we're sort of working within this very dynamic natural environment and very dynamic social cultural environment as well. And we're trying to, I guess, through our work, make a shift in the understanding of landscape, the cultural landscape and landscape as whenua. So this is the story of our Māori-led project. Next slide, Leonardo. Apologies everyone if I pause at all while I'm speaking. With the teams I get pinged by people coming in on the teams from work, so it's probably just distracting. So a summary of where we've come from. So as a trust, we're really interested in sort of the plight, the way the world is at the moment around climate change, biodiversity loss, urbanisation. And we started looking at the call to action and the declaration of concern coming through landscape architecture profession. We also looked at the work by Richard Weller, his early work and his Atlas to the End of the World, looking at the urbanisation that's occurring globally and the biological hotspots. And we started to question ourselves, what would be our offering to this global discourse around landscape, urbanisation, biodiversity loss. And I think the first thing that came to mind is really, what is our unique perspective on landscape? What is an Aotearoa way of thinking about landscape? And so our starting point really was to kick off a conversation with the sector around this. So just next slide, Nada. We engaged with, just next slide there, Nada. We engaged with Julian Boliter, who was who's a researcher out of Western Australia. He had worked with Richard Weller in the past. We couldn't access Richard direct, but Julian runs Urban Design Research Institute that sits within his university, and he sort of helped us bridge the gap between these global issues and what we're faced with tackling. And we brought him over, wheeled him in, and had these sector workshops. We based them in Auckland and Wellington, and we asked the sector around these big questions of what would be our priorities for a strategic place-based approach, setting up our own research strategy to explore our unique perspectives. We partnered with NZILA, Ngā Aho, the Urban Design Forum, and sort of tried to bring the whole sector together in around these big challenges that we're facing. Next slide there, Nada. So this is just some slides of the workshops that we held. It was a great thing to be involved in. Some of the takeaways were around the big movements in environmental work around the eco-modernists and the eco-traditionalists, and these sort of polarizing extremes of technology is going to solve all of our problems, or let's go back to nature. And so we're really interested in that, and we think the book in itself offers some interesting perspectives about that and how to navigate that. Next slide there, Nada. So these were the sort of the four or five priorities that came out of the workshops. The one that we focused in on first is the cultural dimension of landscape. And so this was really the background to the project, where we're coming from in terms of the Landscape Foundation's work, advocating for the landscape and trying to also help navigate some of these bigger global issues, but in a local place-based way. Later, if you could jump to the next slide. So here we are. This is the book, and I think it's right for me to pass directly over to Carolyn as the editor of the book to talk through her work and her experience in developing it. Over to you, Carolyn.
Kia ora, Sam. Thank you. And the background of this book is really quite something. When it landed with me, it was a wonderfully eclectic myriad collection of short opinion pieces, long academic essays, broad research overviews or detailed case studies, polemic challenges, and all responding to a really broad question, being the importance of research on culture and landscape. So people had really come at this from a whole host of really fascinating experiences and perspectives, which at first seemed a little overwhelming. It was really interesting, though, as we started to look at the collection of material that had come back to us, how it didn't fall easily into what I think from a Pākehā perspective we normally tend to, where we kind of break things into easily defined categories. Let's categorize and create blocks of knowledge which may have threads between them. No, it really started to assert itself as a hikoi, a story that starts with the spirit of the land and moves right through to what are we doing, how are we living with and celebrating the spirit of the land. So the book goes through from us starting at Wairua o te Whenua. In the words of Kim Penitito, Our whakapapa descends from Te Kore and comes to light when Papatuanuku and Ranginui are born from the throes of darkness. Like all things, we possess Māori. And that was a really critical starting point for this book and for where the Landscape Foundation is going in terms of contributing a voice, a Māori-led voice to the issues that we face in terms of landscape and our place in the world. I think another really exciting aspect of this was, and especially being very aware of my own positionality as a Pākehā researcher, that people's individual writing styles and writing voices came through loud and clear. So this book is not a process of trying to mesh a whole lot of styles, a whole lot of ways of being in the world into one defined, homogeneous narrative, but actually it lets the complexity through. It acknowledges that complexity and celebrates it with it. And you'll find that we don't just start with here's the spirit of the thing and now let's move right on to the practicalities. No, every chapter begins with a reaffirmation of Māori people's place in this land in particular, and how their voice gives direction and purpose to the rest of us as we try to understand and come alongside and participate in a journey that is so much more than us. So I've already mentioned Kim Penatito. Chapter 2 is forefronted by Wayne Knox as he talks about whenua and identity. And this isn't just an academic person speaking from the ivory tower. Wayne Knox is working at the forefront of Māori housing provision. We move through to Lena Henry, who speaks about whenua Māori and state planning, and gives us a really brutal insight into how at every stage of Aotearoa development, Māori, Te Ao Māori and Māori understandings of land and landscape have been systematically disenfranchised. Becky Kiddle at the beginning of chapter 4, and Becky is a well-celebrated writer in Aotearoa urbanism, reminding us that cities have always been indigenous. And how do we look not only to our rural landscapes, but to our city landscapes as places of Māori indigeneity and agency. Andrew Craig, the absolutely fantastic painter, it's almost like a pause in the book as we re-look at the landscape through his particular painterly lens. Fleur Palmer talking about social equity and self-determination at the beginning of chapter 6. And then Te Kerekere Roycroft talking about identity through whenua, reconnecting with her place in the world as a Māori woman and landscape architect. So that's how the book evolved as a collection. And I really recommend not only to dip into it and read the things that catch your particular eye, but also to treat it as a full story from beginning to end that leads us on a journey of opening our minds to, for me anyway, different ways of seeing the world. Thank you. So I'll hand back to you, Sam.
Hey, kia ora, Carolyn. Thank you so much for that run through of the book. We're now going to hand over to Jan and Will, and they're going to talk about the actual production of the book and the sort of making of the thing that you see in front of you there. So hand over to Jan and Will.
So Jan's going first. Kia koutou to solar, and I'm just going to talk about the book production or parts of it. Once we'd decided to produce this book and Di had begun to contact her extensive list of friends, academics, practitioners and influencers, we needed to actually find a publisher. But who? And that was the big question. Did we go big, small, specialist, university-based producer of academic books? And eventually we were pointed in the direction of Mary Egan Publishing and got hold of the brilliant Sophia, who quickly provided us with a detailed quote that met our expectations. Next, a decision over the potential number of words and form that the book would take. Things like how many pages, what was the size of the book going to be, was it going to have a hard cover or a soft cover, should we even have a fold-in flap as you've seen on it, which makes the hard cover more resilient, what was the paper type going to be, and how many illustrations, etc. were we going to need. Fundraising at the stage was also a bother. We couldn't begin until we had a budget, and we couldn't budget until we had a publisher. And consequently, a lot of our initial budgeting was pure guesswork, as we hadn't done that before. But we were helped again by Sophia. We need to think about postage. How much was it going to cost to post one of these books out? We didn't know how much it weighed. What sort of promotion were we going to do? There was a line item in the budget that covered some sort of promotion. Was it going to be enough? Did we need extra artwork and photography? Slowly, it all worked through, and we started applying for funding. And we discovered that most funding organisations, like trusts, had a long lead-in time, and of course we wanted to know that we had the money yesterday. We'd applied to about 5 organisations by the time COVID struck and got in touch with many others who weren't interested in us. They seemed to prefer projects where they could actually touch the plants or see the plants in the ground. Eventually, the outcome of COVID was that all funding was suspended, except for the Community Grants Fund, which dispenses lotto profits to worthy applications. We'd applied for $20,000, we got $9,999. And in the meantime, Di and Carolyn harassed the writers and invited new writers to contribute. And Carolyn began the pre-edit, and we made weighty decisions like what typeface should we use? Where should the page number go? Should we use macrons? Should we interpret Māori words? If so, where should we put the interpretation? And should we put the title on each chapter of each page? And of course, we had to again hound the authors to submit their articles, and in general terms to upgrade the quality of their photographs. And through this phase, it became obvious that we might need a few more photographs and that Indigenous graphics could be used on the cover and to introduce each chapter. And I'm just going to turn over to Will now.
Thanks, Jan. Hello everybody. Picking up that thread really in the kind of visual side of the book. So the cover image that you've seen on the previous slides is by a photographer from the Gisborne area, Josie McClutchie. We made contact with Josie because of some other work of hers that we'd seen, which really had the character, quality, kind of flavour, and the people and landscapes that we kind of wanted to communicate, and or how we wanted to communicate. So we eventually commissioned her to do a shoot specifically for us, and the cover images is one of the outputs from that. So we had a selection process to sort of land on something that went with both the typography, the titling, the other content that we needed on the cover, and that we felt was kind of a powerful message about landscape. So that was the kind of photography part. I also coordinated with authors who had some photographs to provide, and we weren't able to obtain permissions for all of them or obtain the originals. So there was just from a book production point of view, there's an amount of coordination work, if you like, required to assimilate your photographs of a suitable quality, so that they can be, can illustrate the stories appropriately. So just talking about these images on the slides here, we also had a conversation which was initiated by a contact from the publisher with a young illustrator, Māori illustrator called Wairi Macmillan. And what we basically came up with a very open brief, which was formulated from essentially the book structure that Carolyn had formulated from the book content, which was really, I suppose, creation story beginning to end. But we wanted to draw, I suppose, graphical influences or possibilities through the story. So the format we ended up with is 3 color illustrations, which I personally think are absolutely fantastic, and I recommend you get hold of Nada's book there and just have a look at the illustrations, because alone, or as well as, because the work in those is really something quite special to behold, and we only are showing a small selection here. So the method, if you like, that we used was to have introductory illustrations almost as section dividers, and the 7 chapters are prefaced each by black and white images like the ones you see on the screen. And I mean, you can look for yourselves and see that we're beginning to see imagery which is more than. I mean, my personal view is that the series of slides or images in the book have a compelling story all of their own, as well as beside and in connection with the content in the story, because in the books itself, because they're also telling their own story from an opening to a conclusion. So I personally was delighted with the kind of iterative process with the illustrator. We came up in a very much a design process, some first initial thoughts after a brief, and then some kind of mashing together of that with how would we format into the book in page spreads. How does that kind of work? Are you looking at an opening page? Is it before a chapter? These kinds of things. How to place the text so it doesn't compete with the images. And then we also have these as artworks in their own right. So they're essentially freestanding, if you like, freestanding pieces, which I believe Jan might talk to this, have a plan for as prints and prints that are available as a separate kind of line of creative work. Jan, have you got a comment on that?
Not at the moment, but I'll come back to it. Because I just want to say that at this stage, that it took us until November the 18th, 2020, before all the chapters were collected together and edited with pre-editing before we could send it back to the publisher. And things moved quite quickly once they got hold of it. And the official edit was completed before Christmas, which apparently was very quick, thanks to Carolyn, the work that she had done on it. And then the book was sent backwards and forwards to us for us to make sure that what the authors were saying was correct, and that everything worked. And it went back for layout, which is what Will has been talking about, and the development of the overlying graphics. And it took till the end of June before it was sent off to the publishers in China. And yes, we did look at getting it done here, but it was a lot more expensive and a lot more inefficient. And we had an expected publishing time of 12 weeks. And of course, that blew out a little. And the advanced 20 copies of it were airlifted to us and arrived in November 2020. And of course, we all oohed and ahed over our creation. Our promotional activities started immediately. Books were sent to key influencers, and we waited for the other 1,480 out of the 1,500 copies to arrive by sea. And we waited and we waited. And they eventually arrived, we think, on Christmas Eve, but they had to wait, A, be downloaded at a very busy ports of Auckland, and B, sit in the warehouse because nobody was there to move them on until the holiday period was over. So we had already established an online ordering process, which had been active since early November. So we had immediate orders to fulfill, and the books, and we started doing that. The first stuff got posted out on the 13th of January. The books were released to the wholesalers in March, despite us not having an official launch, again because of COVID. And at last count, which was a couple of weeks ago, we had either given away or sold just under half our print run of 1,500. And our publishers assure us that this is an excellent result. And to come back to Will's question, you can actually still buy the book online on our website, and you can also buy these prints, which we have got for sale, and we order them through an art printer, so they're on art paper, and you can choose whether you want them to be signed or not signed. So you can buy them as a set, or you can buy them individually. So that's it from me. Thank you. Will, any more from you?
No, that's covered all I have on that. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much, Jan and Will. Yeah, and as the Landscape Foundation is a non-for-profit organisation, we are reliant on the sales of the book and the prints as well. So yeah, just encourage you all to get a look at the book, jump online at the Landscape Foundation website, or go to the nearest bookshop, because I think it's available through Book Cools and Paper Plus, and it's out there. So I thank you both so much. Nada, I'll just introduce our next speaker. If you go to the next slide, Dr. Elena Renata. We're going to run a bit of a Q&A session. Elena, I wondered if you'd introduce yourself first, and then I can jump in to ask you a couple of questions.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sam. Kia ora, everybody. I won't do my full mihi whakatau or pepeha because we are a bit short of time, but my name is Elena Renata. I'm a Māori landscape architect of Kaitahu Whakapapa. I currently live in Australia, in Brisbane, working on Turrbal and Yagara land, which are stolen lands, not unlike many of our lands back home in Aotearoa. And I guess a lot of my work throughout my career for the last nearly 20 years, which is a bit terrifying, has been working with Indigenous communities, be it either in Aotearoa with iwi and hapu, or working in Australia with mob or Aboriginal clans across Queensland, the Northern Territory, and WA. So I'm joining from Brisbane, where it's a balmy sort of 30 odd degrees. I'm sure you're all a bit colder back home in Ōtautahi, but kia ora.
Kia ora, Elena. So yeah, I guess the first question is, as a practitioner and academic, how are you commonly required to position your writing, and how did this book in particular bring your Māori-led thinking or differ from the standard academic requirements that you're bound by in your day-to-day work?
Thanks, Sam. Look, it's interesting. In that last 15 to 20 years, you are repeatedly asked to contribute, or asked if you're willing to contribute to a lot of different conversations, and this will happen for many of the students that are listening throughout your career. And in those early stages of your career, you tend to say yes to everything, and you do that because it's a great opportunity. And one of the things I've sort of realised in sort of the more recent probably years or the last decade is that you can actually be selective about who you want to tell your story to and how you want to tell your story. And the sad thing about our industries that we tend to work in is that they are still very focused on objective outcomes and quantitative data, and less about the subjective storyline of landscape in particular. And so this book and this opportunity to contribute for me was a chance to actually reposition my writing as a Māori woman, and talking through a Māori lens, and I guess breaking down some of those rules around what traditional writing expects of us. And to have that freedom has actually been quite uncommon, and it was really nice to see that the book wasn't just Māori led. The kaupapa, or the way that the book was approached, in every aspect had a very strong Māori, I guess, influence throughout it, and that was through the conversations or the timelines that the space was given for authors to reflect and not just produce, and to take creative license in how they produced their work and how they told their story, whether it was first person, third person, whether it was creative, artistic, poetic. And that was really important for me. And so when you get to that point in your career where you can discern what you want to contribute to, this was not just an opportunity, this was something I felt really compelled and emotional about contributing to. And that's quite different to standard academic writing, very different to standard academic writing, actually.
Kia ora, Elena. And so I guess building on that, to what extent did you consider the readership when you were writing your chapter in particular?
Well, I guess with that approach of it being Māori-led, it meant that I could step away from those rules. And for the first time probably ever, completely honestly, I wrote more for myself than I did for anybody else. I sort of had my own hierarchy of who I was writing to, and the first audience was me. So I wanted to be proud of what I wrote, and so I wanted to write something that I guess did come from the heart, and that was truth-telling, and it was vulnerable, and it had expression in it. And with that, it meant that I knew that there were going to be certain readers that it would probably connect with more than others. And I was sort of okay that not every reader may understand some of the nuances of what I was talking about, and that we have a certain way as Māori that we speak and converse and articulate, and it's not always overt, and there are subtleties in our narrative, and that I felt comfortable and that certain readers pick up on those subtleties. So there was almost a hierarchy in that it was for me more than anything. It was for my Māori, tangata whenua whānau, mana whenua, and then it was for anybody else who could take the opportunity to maybe look at it in that poetic sense. And they say with poetry that everybody reads it and reads a different story. I wanted it almost to have that influence and impact as well, that each person would pick it up and they might gain something different from it. But because it was such a reflective piece, it wasn't so prescribed, like that you were learning something, you were more experiencing something.
Kia ora, Elena. And so, yeah, it seems like you brought all your mahi to this chapter, and you actually painted some of the pieces for your chapter. Is this something you commonly do, or can you tell us a bit about these pieces in particular and how they're important to your work in this instance?
Yeah, sure. It's not something I commonly do. It's actually the first time. This book was a first for me in many regards, and it was the first time that I had painted any pieces for sort of being associated with some writing, and that's pretty nerve-wracking. Putting yourself out there like that, I was pretty apprehensive. One of the pieces, the one around Ihumatao, was completely coincidental, and this happens a lot. I find when I'm back home standing on my tūranga waiwai, I just happened to be home. Di just happened to say to me that she was going out to Ihumatao, did I want to come? And going out there and connecting, ironically, on that day with, the ihi and the wehi and the wana of that place and what was happening there, just prompted me to start painting. And similarly with the writing, as I was writing, I just naturally started sort of picking up my watercolours and painting as I was telling that story. And I think more than anything, it was just that sometimes the stories of the amount of hurt that we feel about landscape and how, well, not necessarily landscape as in the shaped land, but the feelings that we have for whenua are quite hard to express in words. And sometimes you can only tell that story through other mediums. And in this instance, while the words were quite personal and reflective, I felt that something needed to go with that to show the harshness and the boldness of, I guess, the abrupt feelings that I feel every day about how there was an intentional severance between First Peoples and the land through colonisation. And I see that every day here in Australia, and the hurt that causes and the cities that have been built on that, and that idea that we just really need to express that. And sometimes words just don't cut it. Yeah.
Yeah, I can totally I hear what you're saying there, Elena. I had the privilege of working on Rangiriri, which was the site of a battle in 1863 through the Raupatu, through the British invasion of the Waikato and displacement of those peoples. And you're right, there is a lot to break down and work through in these difficult histories. So yeah, I guess this brings us to our last question, but how important is that those concepts of decolonisation and landscape association and land management, and with your writing, how do you bring out that authenticity, like you were talking about then, around those re-indigenising concepts in landscape?
Yeah, I guess it's funny working in Australian context, because the history is different and the story is different, and I think it's actually working here and seeing the amount of hurt here has given me a different fundamental perspective of how much decolonising actually needs to happen. Not only are we still doing a lot of colonial design in places like Australia, and it happens back home in New Zealand too, we're actually in some ways being more overt in our colonisation and our design, because our designs are being influenced by a whole lot of other factors, which is scary, because we're talking about thousands of years of association. I actually usually talk to my students about, this is the spectrum of time, that people have been in a place. And if we talk about Australia, we're talking 80,000 years that people have been here. And the story of colonisation is this long on that journey, but has had such a significant impact. The language has changed, the land has changed, there are now cities. You can't see, and as we say in Aotearoa, you can't see our faces in these places anymore. And until we start to strip some of that back, and some of my students actually said to me last week, oh, those black fellas, they just want everything their way, they just want everything to be black again. No, we're literally talking like, can you just come like a millimetre back towards at least, telling the true story of place. It's that truth telling of landscape and how much the landscape has evolved and changed, and the impact that has on Indigenous culture, which is so interwoven and interconnected with language and survival and intangible associations and spiritual elements, that if we don't start to pull back from this colonial approach to design, we lose so much. And I guess the thing is that if we don't acknowledge that in New Zealand and Aotearoa, if we don't acknowledge that there are thousands of years of association with landscape, in Australia there's 80,000 years of association with landscape, then we're missing a massive portion of the knowledge of how the whenua can be cared for, and how that actually caring for whenua cares for our health and our well-being as a people. So not just as Māori people or as Aboriginal people, but that everybody lives off the land. And if we don't have a healthy environment, we haven't got much. So I think a lot of authors here, so some of you may have heard of the books The Dark Emu or Fire Country, which talk about traditional land management and how land was cared for through time, is really important, because there is a lot of traditional wisdom in there that can help us move towards an environment that's going to sustain us for longer, because at the moment it's not looking very positive. So yeah, there's learnings there that need to be shared.
Yeah, kia ora Neila and Elena. This is really good stuff, isn't it? Connecting with the system thinking, Indigenous knowledge, and then as concepts for taking our landscape architecture, our design, and our land management processes forward. It's really exciting to hear you talk about all of that. I guess I've had the benefit of working alongside kaitiaki and iwi across the country in my role, and those enduring relationships and those outcomes that we've achieved together in partnership. It's something that you sort of hope everyone gets that opportunity in their practice. That sort of brings us to the conclusion of